At 6:47 on a Sunday evening, my 8-month pregnant stepdaughter pointed across my own dining table and said, "My dad is dead. That room is for my baby now. Get out." Nobody at the table reminded her whose house she was sitting in. I remember the exact time because the old wall clock over the doorway had just clicked past 6:45, and I had been wondering whether I should get up and warm the gravy. That was the kind of thing I still thought about back then. Gravy, coffee, whether everybody had enough potatoes. Keeping people comfortable had become a habit. My name is Diane Mercer. I was 58 that spring, and my husband, Robert, had been dead for 7 months. We had been married 17 years. 7 months sounds like enough time to understand that somebody is gone. It isn't. I still woke up some mornings and reached toward his side of the bed before my mind caught up. His reading glasses were still inside the top drawer of his nightstand. I had donated most of his clothes, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything with those glasses. Robert used to wear them low on his nose while reading the Wisconsin State Journal, then look over the top of them whenever he thought I was saying something ridiculous. I missed that look. I missed a lot of things. Sunday dinner had been his tradition, so after he died, I kept doing it. Maybe that was my first mistake. That evening I'd made pot roast, carrots, mashed potatoes, and those frozen dinner rolls Robert always liked, even though he claimed homemade ones tasted better. His daughter, Kelsey, sat across from me with one hand resting on her belly. Her husband, Tyler, was beside her. Robert's son, Evan, sat at the end of the table. Kelsey was 32 and due in about 5 weeks. She had barely touched her food when she said, casually, "So Tyler and I are moving in next weekend. I thought I'd misheard her." I set down my fork. "Moving in where?" She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "Here." Tyler kept eating. Evan stopped. I said, "You mean you'd like to stay here for a while?" Kelsey sighed. That little sigh bothered me more than it should have. "Diane, our lease is up at the end of the month. We're not signing another year when there's a 4-bedroom house sitting here with one person in it." I looked at Tyler. He finally glanced up. "It makes financial sense." That phrase almost made me laugh. Tyler worked in luxury auto sales over in Middleton, and from what Robert used to say, Tyler could make a bad idea sound like a tax strategy if you gave him 5 minutes. I folded my napkin. "How long were you planning to stay?" Kelsey shrugged. "Until we figure things out." Then she smiled a little and said, "Actually, we've already been talking about the upstairs." "The upstairs?" "The primary bedroom." I stared at her. She continued as though we were discussing paint colors. "It has the bigger bathroom, and there's enough space for the bassinet. Then later we could turn the smaller room next to it into the nursery." I said, "That's my bedroom." Kelsey leaned back. "Right now." For a second, nobody said anything. I heard the refrigerator motor kick on behind me. I said, "What does that mean?" She rubbed her stomach and looked annoyed. "Diane, Dad isn't there anymore." That sentence landed differently than the others. Robert had spent the last 5 months of his life mostly in that bedroom. By then, pancreatic cancer had stripped away almost everything people associated with him. He had owned Mercer Marine and Dock for over 30 years. He was 6'1", broad-shouldered, the kind of man who could carry the end of a dock section with 2 younger employees and still complain they were moving too slowly. Toward the end, I had to help him stand. Some nights, it took both arms around his waist just to get him 10 feet to the bathroom. My knees had gotten bad during those months. I gained 25 pounds because I ate standing at counters and slept in pieces. I stopped coloring my hair, stopped noticing what I looked like, really. But I stayed, every night, every appointment, every medication alarm. And now Kelsey was telling me that because Robert was dead, his absence had somehow created a vacancy. I said very calmly, "I'm not giving you my bedroom." Her face changed. "You don't need that much space." "I live here?" "So do we, starting next week." "No, Kelsey, you don't." Tyler stared down at his plate. I looked at Evan. He shifted in his chair. "Kels," he said quietly, "maybe just back off a little." She snapped her head toward him. "Stay out of it." Then she looked at me. Her cheeks were flushed. "My dad is dead. That room is for my baby now. Get out." There it was. I waited. I honestly did. I waited for Evan to say something stronger. For Tyler to tell his wife she'd crossed a line. For somebody to acknowledge that I had buried my husband 7 months earlier and was now being ordered out of the home where I'd cared for him. Nobody did. And something inside me just went quiet. For 17 years, whenever Kelsey made a sharp comment, Robert would squeeze my hand later and say, "Give her time." I had given her 17 years. I stood up. "Okay," Kelsey blinked. "Okay, what?" "I'll leave." She actually laughed once, nervously. "Oh, come on, don't be dramatic." "I don't think I'm being dramatic." I walked upstairs. My knee hurt halfway up, and I had to grip the banister for a second. In the bedroom, I took out 2 suitcases, jeans, sweaters, underwear, toiletries, my medication, phone charger. Then I opened Robert's nightstand. His reading glasses were sitting exactly where I'd left them. I put them in my purse. Kelsey appeared in the doorway while I was zipping the second suitcase. "You're seriously leaving tonight?" I looked at her. "You told me to get out." I was mad. "I know." She crossed her arms. "So where are you going?" I didn't answer. At 9:18, I loaded the bags into my Subaru and drove away from the house. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't call a friend and ask for a couch. About 40 minutes later, I turned off the main road near Lake Mendota and followed a narrow lane lined with maples just starting to leaf out. At the end sat a small cedar-sided cottage with a screened porch and dark windows. I parked. My knee complained when I climbed out. Then I reached into my purse, found a key I hadn't used in years, and unlocked the front door. The lights came on. Kelsey thought she'd thrown me out with nowhere to go. What she didn't know was that the little house overlooking the lake already belonged to me. 3 days later, I woke to the sound of the furnace banging like somebody had dropped a wrench inside it. For one confused second, I didn't know where I was. Then I saw the lake through the bedroom window. Gray water, bare branches, a pair of geese walking around the edge of the yard like they owned the place. And I remembered. The cottage had belonged to my parents. They bought it in 1989, back when that side of Lake Mendota was still quiet enough that my father complained if more than 2 boats passed before breakfast. After Mom died, my sister and I inherited it together. A few years later, she wanted cash for a move to Arizona, so I bought her half. Robert knew about the cottage, of course. It had never been a secret. What Kelsey didn't know was that I had kept it entirely in my own name. For the past 12 years, I had rented it to a retired University of Wisconsin history professor named Frank Delaney. Frank moved into assisted living that winter, and I'd been slowly fixing the place up after he left. Nothing fancy. New water heater, fresh paint, a repaired porch screen. I had somebody refinish the floors because Robert said if we ever retired there, he wasn't spending his last years looking at those scratched-up boards. He never got the chance. That was the part nobody saw when they imagined me enjoying some secret lakeside escape. My first night there, I cried sitting at the kitchen counter with a sleeve of peanut butter crackers. I had forgotten to buy groceries. The faucet over the sink dripped every 11 or 12 seconds. The furnace made that awful clunk. My right knee throbbed from carrying suitcases, and the cottage smelled faintly like old wood and lemon cleaner. At 2:13 in the morning, I looked across the dark room and thought, Robert would have fixed that faucet before he even took his coat off. Then I cried harder. Not because I wanted to go back to the Madison house, because I wanted my husband back. There is a difference. The next morning, Marcia showed up carrying 2 coffees from Collectivo and a paper bag with blueberry muffins. Robert's older sister had never believed in arriving empty-handed or quietly. She stepped inside, looked around, and said, "Well, this is nicer than the jail cell I pictured after Kelsey threw you out." I laughed, despite myself. "Good morning to you, too." She handed me a coffee. Then her face changed. "She really said that?" I nodded. Marcia sat at the small kitchen table. "You know she can't throw you out of your own house." "I know." "Then why did you leave?" I pulled the lid off my coffee and stared at the steam. That question had been bothering me, too. Finally, I said, "Because I think I needed to see what she'd do if nobody stopped her." Marcia studied me, then she nodded once. "That," she said, "I understand." By noon, I had groceries from Woodman's, a new shower curtain from Target, and 3 furnace companies saved in my phone. For a few hours, life felt almost ordinary. Then Evan called. He sounded uncomfortable before he even said hello. "Diane, just so you know, Kelsey and Tyler are already moving stuff in." I closed my eyes. "Into the house?" "Yeah." "Into my bedroom?" There was a pause. "Yeah." I looked out at the lake. Of course they were. Evan kept talking. He told me Tyler's income had been bad for months. The luxury dealership had changed commission structures, and he hadn't been hitting his numbers. Kelsey and Tyler had debt too. Around $31,000 between credit cards and a personal loan, from what Evan understood. Their apartment lease was ending. The baby was coming. "They've been counting on Dad's estate," Evan said. "Counting on what exactly?" "I don't think they know." That answer told me plenty. Kelsey wasn't just grieving. She had built an entire financial plan around money she assumed would show up. I said, "Did Robert ever promise her the house?" "No." "The business?" "Not that I know of." "Then what exactly does she think she's inheriting?" Evan sighed. "I think she thinks everything." That afternoon, I tried not to think about it. I unpacked towels, cleaned a closet, found one of my mother's old Pyrex bowls in a cabinet and stood there smiling like an idiot. At 4:26, my phone rang. Kelsey. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I saw the second call come through immediately. I answered. She didn't say hello. "Why did you block me from changing the utilities?" Her voice was so sharp that for half a second I thought something had happened with the baby. "What?" "The electric account, they're saying I can't change it." I leaned against the counter. "I didn't block anything." "Well, somebody did." "Why are you changing the electric account?" "Because I'm living here now." There it was. Not staying here, living here. I said, "Kelsey, whose name is on the account?" She was quiet for a beat. "Yours." "Then that's probably your answer." She made an angry sound. "This is ridiculous." "No, what's ridiculous is that you're trying to change household accounts 3 days after telling me to leave." "I'm trying to organize things before the baby comes." "At my house." "Dad's house." I let the silence sit. Then I said, "We'll talk later." I hung up. The next morning I called Madison Gas and Electric myself. The representative was polite. She told me someone had tried to add a new primary contact and update billing information, but they hadn't completed the request because the account holder had to authorize it. Nothing illegal had happened. Nothing dramatic, but it told me exactly what I needed to know. Kelsey wasn't waiting to see what happened. She was settling in. So I called Alan Rosen. Alan had handled Robert's business paperwork for years and helped us update estate documents after the diagnosis. He answered on the third ring. "Diane?" "Alan, I need to ask you something about the house." "What house?" "The Madison house." There was a pause. "What about it?" I told him the story. Not every emotional detail, just the facts. Sunday dinner, Kelsey moving in, the bedroom, the utility account. When I finished, Alan was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning." That made me nervous. Why? Because I think Kelsey is operating under a misunderstanding. The next morning I drove downtown and sat across from him while he pulled property records onto his computer. Alan adjusted his glasses. "Diane, you bought that house in 2002. "Yes." "You married Robert in 2006. "Yes." "And you never transferred title." "No." He turned the monitor slightly toward me. "Then Robert never owned it." I looked at the screen. My name, just my name. Alan tapped the record with one finger. "Kelsey didn't inherit your house." I sat back. For the first time since Sunday dinner, I felt something other than hurt. Not satisfaction exactly, clarity. Kelsey hadn't inherited my bedroom. She hadn't inherited the kitchen. She hadn't inherited the driveway. She hadn't inherited one floorboard. And she had no idea. A week after that Sunday dinner, I got a phone call from a contractor named Mike Dougherty. I was standing in the cottage kitchen trying to figure out why the dishwasher smelled like a wet basement when my phone rang. Mrs. Mercer? Yes. This is Mike with Doherty Renovations. I just wanted to follow up about the estimates for your place on Blackhawk Drive. I stopped what I was doing. What estimates? He went quiet. That was the first sign something was wrong. The upstairs remodel? I didn't request an upstairs remodel. Another pause. Then Mike said carefully, I met with a Tyler Brooks at the property. Of course he did. I pulled out a chair and sat down. What exactly did Tyler ask you to do? Mike clearly realized he'd wandered into a family problem and wanted no part of it, but he explained. Tyler had asked for estimates to open the wall between two upstairs bedrooms, remodel the primary bathroom, replace some flooring, install built-in nursery cabinets, and update part of the kitchen. The preliminary total was around $86,000. Has anything been signed? I asked. No, ma'am. Has anybody started work? Absolutely not. That mattered. Mike hadn't checked the deed because Tyler hadn't hired him yet. He'd simply walked through the house, taken measurements, and prepared an estimate. What did he tell you? I asked. Mike hesitated. He said they were taking over the house from his wife's family. I almost admired the wording. Not exactly a lie, not remotely the truth. I thanked Mike and told him there would be no renovations authorized by me. Then I sat at that kitchen table for several minutes staring at my phone. $86,000. Kelsey and Tyler couldn't afford another apartment lease, but apparently they could imagine an $86,000 renovation. That afternoon, Marcia came by. When I told her, she took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. They're remodeling a house they don't own? Planning to. With what money? I think the money they're planning to inherit. Marcia stared at me. Have they inherited it? No. Do they know how much they're inheriting? No. She put her glasses back on. Well, that's efficient. I laughed. I needed to. 2 days later, the situation got even more ridiculous. A furniture store called about delivery of a sectional to the Madison house. A $6,400 Italian sectional. Apparently my phone number was still attached to the address from a purchase Robert and I had made years earlier. The woman asked what delivery window worked for me. I think there's been a mistake. She confirmed the address. Then she said the purchaser's name was Tyler Brooks. I rubbed my forehead. I didn't authorize furniture to be delivered to that property. There was some confusion. A supervisor got involved, and eventually the delivery was stopped. Tyler called me 20 minutes later. What did you do? I prevented a couch I didn't buy from being delivered to my house. We paid for that. Then have it delivered somewhere you own. He hung up on me. Later I learned he'd lose part of the deposit because of the cancellation terms. When I told Marcia, she laughed so hard she started coughing. $6,400? Apparently it's Italian. For that price, it better cook. That was probably the most fun I had all month. It didn't last. The following Tuesday, Alan asked me to come back to his office. Robert's longtime CPA, George Kaplan, joined us. George had been going through the final business records for Mercer Marine and Dock. Robert had built that company from one used pickup and a borrowed trailer. By the time he got sick, 15 people depended on it for a paycheck. His illness hit the company hard. Robert missed estimates, projects got delayed, insurance costs kept coming whether work did or not. I knew all that. What I hadn't thought about in months was how much money I'd put into keeping it alive. George placed a spreadsheet in front of me. Do you recognize these transfers? I did. 20,000, 15,000, 8,000, another 25. They stretched across roughly 18 months. The total at the bottom was $142,000. I stared at it. I knew it was a lot. George nodded. The books treated these as advances from you to the company. Alan added, and Robert signed acknowledgments for them. I remembered those papers. At the time, they hadn't felt important. I was thinking about chemotherapy schedules and whether Robert could keep down soup. Money was just another emergency. So what happens now? I asked. Alan folded his hands. The company has to address legitimate debts before the remaining business interests are distributed under Robert's estate plan. I immediately thought of Kelsey and Evan. I don't want to take their inheritance. You aren't. Alan's voice was firm. This isn't their money being taken from them. This is money the business already owes you. Whatever remains is handled according to Robert's estate plan. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want revenge that required stealing from Robert's children. I wanted them to stop treating my life like something they could divide among themselves. That evening, Evan called. His voice sounded different. Diane, can I tell you something without you getting mad at me? That's usually not a promising beginning. He gave a nervous little laugh. Then nothing. Evan? Kelsey has been talking to people. About what? You? My stomach tightened. He told me she'd spoken to relatives on Robert's side, an aunt in Green Bay, 2 cousins, a family friend who'd known Robert for 30 years. The story Kelsey was telling was simple. Toward the end of Robert's illness, I couldn't handle it. I checked out. She and Evan had to step in because I'd practically abandoned their father. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. I looked across the cottage at Robert's reading glasses sitting on the counter. She said I left him? Evan didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking about the house, or the $86,000 renovation, or Tyler's ridiculous Italian couch. I remembered one night near the end when Robert was too weak to stand by himself. He'd been embarrassed that I had to help him to the bathroom. He kept apologizing. I had my arms around his waist, trying to hold both of us steady, and I said, Robert, after 17 years, you really think this is the thing that's going to scare me off? He laughed. Barely. But he laughed. I slept in a recliner beside his hospice bed that night, and most nights after it. Now his daughter was telling people I had walked away. That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. Taking over my bedroom was one thing. Trying to take over my history with Robert was another. 3 days after Evan told me what Kelsey had been saying, my phone started filling up with messages from people who hadn't called once during Robert's final month. That alone told me something. His cousin Linda wrote first. I know everyone is grieving, Diane, but throwing Kelsey out this close to her due date seems unnecessarily cruel. I read it twice. I hadn't thrown anybody out. In fact, I was the one living somewhere else. Then Robert's aunt Carol called from Green Bay. She was 74 and had known Kelsey since birth. I understood why her instinct was to protect her. What I didn't expect was the sentence she used. Robert would be ashamed of how you're treating his daughter. I was standing in the checkout line at Walgreens when she said it. For a moment, I couldn't move. The cashier had already started scanning my toothpaste and arthritis cream, and there I was holding my phone while a woman who hadn't seen Robert in his final 6 months told me what he would have thought. I paid, walked to my Subaru, and sat behind the wheel. I didn't cry. I almost wished I had. Instead, I started wondering if they were right. That's the ugly thing about being accused by enough people. Even when you know the facts, eventually you start reviewing your own behavior. Kelsey was 8 months pregnant. Her father was dead. Her husband wasn't earning what he used to. Was I making things worse because I was angry? For one evening, I seriously considered calling Alan and telling him to forget everything. Let them stay 6 months, maybe a year. The house wasn't hurting anything. Then Marcia came over. I told her what I was thinking. She listened without interrupting, which for Marcia was practically a medical emergency. Finally, she said, "Do you want them there?" "No." "Did you invite them?" "No." "Did Kelsey ask?" I looked at her. "No." Marcia took a sip of coffee. "Then don't confuse surrender with kindness." I sighed. She's having the baby. Yes, women have been having babies without stealing their stepmother's bedroom for quite some time. I laughed before I could stop myself. Marcia leaned forward. "Helping someone is letting them stay in your house, Diane. What Kelsey did was tell you the house stopped being yours because Robert died. Those aren't the same thing." That stayed with me. The following morning, Kelsey made the decision easier. At 9:06, she sent me a text. "We're having the locks changed Monday. Please arrange a time to pick up whatever you left." I stared at the screen. Then I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Alan. He called less than 10 minutes later. "Don't respond." I wasn't planning to. Good. Alan wasn't interested in creating some dramatic eviction scene. He explained that when family members have been allowed into a home and establish occupancy, removing them isn't something you improvise because you're angry. We would document everything and use the appropriate written process. So that's what we did. No police at the door, no belongings dumped on the lawn, no screaming match. Kelsey and Tyler received formal written notice that they did not have permission to remain indefinitely and would need to vacate within the applicable period. Predictably, that produced another round of outrage. I stopped reading the family group chat. About a week later, I went to Mercer Marine and Dock to pick up a few of Robert's personal things. I hadn't been inside since shortly after the funeral. The place smelled exactly the same: coffee, lumber, lake water, and whatever industrial cleaner they used on the concrete floors. For a second, I expected Robert to come out of his office complaining about somebody ordering the wrong bolts. Instead, his longtime office manager, Nancy, hugged me. Before I left, she said, "There's something in his desk I think you should have." She brought me a plain white envelope. My name was on the front in Robert's handwriting. I sat in his old office and opened it. It wasn't a will, it wasn't some secret legal document, it was just Robert talking to me. He apologized for something I hadn't realized bothered him. All those years when Kelsey was difficult, he had kept telling me to give her time. "I asked you to be patient because it was easier than asking my kids to grow up." I had to stop reading. That sounded exactly like him. Then, halfway down the second page, I laughed. Robert mentioned the ugly blue recliner at the lake cottage. I'd hated that chair from the day he bought it at an estate sale. His letter said, "If you ever end up living at the lake, don't throw out the blue chair. It's still the most comfortable chair we've ever owned, and you're still wrong about it." I covered my mouth. I was laughing and crying at the same time in that empty office. Near the end, Robert mentioned the business, not numbers. He simply said he knew how much of my own savings I'd used to keep his employees paid while he was sick. Then, he wrote, "Don't let guilt turn what you worked for into something everybody else thinks they're entitled to." I folded the letter carefully. The accounting records proved the debt. That letter proved something else. Robert had noticed. He knew what those years had cost me. 2 nights later, Evan sent me 6 screenshots. I was already in bed when they came through. The first messages were between Kelsey and Tyler from months before Robert died. At first, they were about expenses: their lease, the baby, Tyler's commissions. Then I reached the 4th screenshot. Kelsey had written, "We move into Dad's house after. Once the baby's settled there, Diane isn't going to make us leave." Tyler had replied, "Then eventually she'll sell. She doesn't need a place that big." I sat up. Another message from Kelsey. "Exactly. She'll cave before she makes us move a baby." I read that sentence 3 times, so this hadn't started at Sunday dinner. The dinner was simply the first time she'd said the plan out loud. The next morning, Alan called about Robert's final estate accounting meeting. It was scheduled for 3 weeks later. "Are you comfortable attending?" he asked. A month earlier, I probably would have found an excuse not to. I looked across the cottage living room. Robert's ugly blue recliner was sitting beside the window. I had found it under a dust cover in the storage room. I smiled. "Yes," I said, "I'll be there." And for the first time since Kelsey told me to get out, I wasn't going there to defend myself. I was going because I finally had nothing left to explain. The estate meeting was on a Thursday morning at Alan Rosen's office in downtown Madison. I got there 12 minutes early. That was a habit Robert used to tease me about. "If Diane arrives on time," he'd say, "check the weather. Something's wrong." I sat in my Subaru for a minute before going inside. My stomach was tight. I had spent 3 weeks telling myself this was just an accounting meeting. Numbers, property records, documents. But families can turn paperwork into something personal faster than you'd believe. Kelsey and Tyler were already there when I walked into the conference room. Kelsey looked exhausted. Her pregnancy had reached that stage where getting comfortable in any chair seemed impossible. Evan sat near the window. Marcia gave me a small nod. Alan was at the head of the table with George Kaplan, Robert's CPA. Nobody exchanged pleasantries. Alan started with Mercer Marine and Dock. George reviewed the company's assets, outstanding obligations, tax issues, and estimated value. I watched Tyler lean forward whenever George mentioned a large number. Then George turned to liabilities. He reached one line and said, "Documented advances payable to Diane Mercer, $142,000. Kelsey's head came up. "What?" George repeated it. She looked at me. "For what?" Alan answered before I could. "Funds Diane advanced to the company during Robert's illness." Kelsey frowned. "But she was his wife." "Yes." "You don't owe your wife money." George spoke calmly. "Robert doesn't. The company does." He placed copies of the records on the table, transfers, ledger entries, signed acknowledgments, dates. Kelsey flipped through them faster than she could possibly read them. "This is ridiculous." "It isn't unusual," George said. "The business needed liquidity. Diane provided it. The advances were recorded." Kelsey looked at me. "So you get $142,000 before we get anything?" I hated the way that sounded. So I answered her myself. "I'm getting back money I already put in." Alan explained that after legitimate obligations were resolved, the remaining business interests would still be distributed according to Robert's estate plan. Kelsey and Evan weren't being disinherited. Nobody was taking what Robert had left them. Kelsey had simply been counting money before she understood where it came from. Then Alan moved to the house. Kelsey immediately said, "I don't understand why that's even part of this meeting. That's our family home." Alan slid a copy of the deed across the table. "It isn't part of Robert's estate." Kelsey stared at him. "What?" "Diane purchased the property in 2002. She and Robert married in 2006. Title remained with Diane." Tyler stopped moving. Alan continued. "Robert never owned the property." Kelsey looked at the deed, then at me, then back at Alan. I watched the realization move across Tyler's face. The contractor, the nursery plans, the sectional, all of it had been built around something they never owned. Kelsey pushed the paper away. "Dad lived there for 17 years. "He did," I said. "So it's his home." "It was his home," I said. "That doesn't make it his property." Her face reddened. Then she said something I think she'd been carrying for years. "You weren't his family before you married him. We were." Nobody moved. It hurt. I wish I could tell you it didn't. After 17 years, part of me still feared that Robert's children saw our marriage as a long visit that ended when he died. I reached into my purse. "I know," Kelsey seemed surprised. I took out Robert's letter. "I never asked to be there before you. I never asked him to choose." I looked down at the pages. "But I was his wife." I read only a small part. Robert's words about asking me to be patient because it had been easier than asking his children to grow up. Then a few lines about the years we'd shared and what I'd done while he was sick. Kelsey stared at the table. I folded the letter. She suddenly said, "You weren't even there half the time at the end." Evan looked at her. "Kelsey." "No, everybody acts like she did everything." I opened the folder I'd brought. Inside was Robert's hospice calendar. Not something I had created for this meeting. It was the same battered calendar I'd kept on our kitchen counter. Medication schedules. Oncology visits, home nurse appointments, my notes about what Robert ate and when he was sick. I pushed it toward her. "I don't need you to thank me for taking care of your father." My voice was quieter than I expected. "But you don't get to tell people I left him." Kelsey didn't touch the calendar. Then she turned toward Evan. "Tell them." He frowned. "Tell them what actually happened." Evan swallowed. "I am." He reached into his jacket and took out several printed pages. I recognized the screenshots. Kelsey did too. Her face changed immediately. "Where did you get those?" "You sent some of them to me, remember? When you were asking what Dad planned to do with the house." He put the pages down. Alan read them. The room became painfully quiet. "Move in after Robert died. Get established. Use the baby's presence to make it harder for me to say no, eventually pressure me to sell." Kelsey looked at Evan. "You're taking her side?" He stared at his sister for several seconds. Then he shook his head. "No," Kelsey gave a bitter laugh. "Sure looks like it." Evan's voice was low. "I'm finally taking Dad's." That was the moment. Not the deed, not the $142,000, that sentence. For 17 years, I had tried so hard not to make Robert's children feel they had to choose between me and their father. And now Evan finally understood that respecting me wasn't betraying Robert. It was respecting the life Robert had chosen. Kelsey started crying, not dramatically. She covered her face and sat there breathing hard. "We don't have anywhere to go," Tyler finally spoke. "We can find something." She turned on him. "With what money?" There it was. Under all the arrogance was fear. Real fear. Their lease was gone. Their debt was real. The baby was coming. I understood that. I just wasn't willing to pay for it with my home. "You have the notice period to find somewhere," I said. Kelsey wiped her face. "You're really making us leave?" "Yes," she stared at me. I continued. "I'll pay the moving company directly. One move, wherever you decide to go." She looked confused. "Why would you do that?" "Because your daughter didn't do any of this." Her hand went automatically to her stomach. "But I'm not paying your rent. I'm not paying your deposit. And you're not staying in my house." Kelsey looked away. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Tyler's phone started ringing. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and declined the call. Marcia leaned toward him. "Please tell me that's the couch." Evan coughed into his hand. I tried not to laugh. I failed. Even George smiled. And after weeks of being told I was vindictive, selfish, and cruel, that little laugh felt surprisingly good. I hadn't taken Kelsey's inheritance. I hadn't taken her father's memory. I hadn't even taken away her chance to start over. I had simply put a fence around the things that had never belonged to her. And for once, I didn't feel guilty about it. Kelsey and Tyler moved out 26 days later. I wasn't there when they left. That was intentional. A moving company from Middleton handled everything, and just as I'd promised, I paid that bill directly. One truck, one move, nothing more. They found a 2-bedroom apartment in Middleton above their original budget, but well below what Tyler had apparently imagined their post-inheritance lifestyle would look like. There was no remodeled primary suite, no custom nursery, no Italian sectional, but there was enough room for a crib. And that was what mattered. I didn't move back into the Madison house. People found that surprising. Even Marcia asked me about it. We were sitting on the screened porch at the lake cottage one afternoon when she said, "You fought that hard to get your house back, and now you're not going to live there?" "I didn't fight to live there." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what did you fight for?" I thought about it. "The right to decide," Marcia smiled. "Fair enough." 5 weeks after the estate meeting, Kelsey gave birth to a healthy little girl, Sophie Elizabeth Brooks. Evan texted me a picture. She had a pink hospital cap pulled down almost to her eyebrows and one tiny fist tucked beside her cheek. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Then I typed, "She's beautiful. Tell Kelsey I'm glad they're both okay. I didn't go to the hospital. That wasn't punishment. I simply didn't know where Kelsey and I stood, and I had finally stopped forcing relationships to look healthier than they were." For almost 2 months, we barely spoke. Meanwhile, the truth about the house worked its way through Robert's family. Some people apologized. Linda called me one evening and said I should have asked you what happened before I opened my mouth. I appreciated that. Aunt Carol didn't apologize. She said, "I still think you could have handled it more gently." A year earlier, I probably would have spent 3 days trying to convince her I wasn't a bad person. This time I said, "You're entitled to think that." Then I changed the subject. That felt like progress. Life at the lake became ordinary in ways I hadn't expected. The furnace got fixed. The dripping faucet needed a $12 part, which would have delighted Robert because he hated paying plumbers for simple repairs. My knee still bothered me, especially in the mornings. And those 25 pounds I'd gained while caring for Robert didn't disappear because I had suddenly discovered self-respect. I started walking. Nothing impressive. 10 minutes along the lake at first, some mornings 15, on bad days 5. I bought better shoes, got my hair trimmed, started cooking actual meals again instead of eating crackers over the sink. Not because I was becoming some new woman. I was 58. I liked the woman I'd been. I just wanted to start taking care of her again. And yes, I kept the ugly blue recliner. I put it beside the living room window where Robert would have wanted it. It was annoyingly comfortable. I never admitted that out loud. Evan began stopping by every couple of weeks. Sometimes he'd bring lunch. Sometimes he'd fix something I hadn't asked him to fix. I think it was his way of apologizing for staying quiet at that dinner. I never made him say it. Marcia came over more often than anyone. One Friday, she arrived holding a bottle of wine and announced, "It was $12. We're adults. We can survive it." We did. As for the Madison house, I rented it to a couple in their 40s. She worked at UW Health, and he taught high school outside Madison. They signed a proper lease, they paid on time, they asked permission before changing anything. You'd be amazed how luxurious basic respect can feel after somebody tries to claim your bedroom. About 4 months after Sophie was born, Kelsey texted me. "Would you meet me for coffee?" I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I agreed. We met at a coffee shop in Middleton on a Tuesday morning, neutral territory. Kelsey arrived carrying Sophie in a car seat. She looked different. Tired, mostly. Not the dramatic kind of tired people talk about, the real kind. Hair pulled back, no makeup, a faint spit-up stain on one shoulder. She sat across from me. For a minute, neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, she said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. She looked down at Sophie. "When Dad died, I got scared." Her voice cracked slightly. "Tyler wasn't making what he used to. Our debt was getting worse. Then I got pregnant, and I just kept thinking Dad had always taken care of things." She rubbed her thumb against the edge of her coffee cup. "I started thinking the house was supposed to take care of things too, the company, everything." I said nothing, she continued. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what was Dad's and started deciding anything connected to him belonged to me. That was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. "It doesn't excuse what you did," I said. "I know. And telling people I abandoned him was cruel." Her eyes filled. "I know." I took a breath. "You were allowed to grieve your father, Kelsey. You weren't allowed to erase his wife." She nodded. There was no big hug, no movie ending. After a while, she lifted Sophie from the car seat. "Would you like to hold her?" I did. Sophie opened her eyes for about 3 seconds, looked completely unimpressed with me, and went back to sleep. I smiled. That was enough for one day. Over time, Kelsey and I found a different relationship, not the old one. Something more careful. There were boundaries now, no financial dependence, no assumptions, no pretending that Sunday dinner had never happened. On Robert's next birthday, I sat by the lake with his reading glasses on the little table beside me. For a long time, I'd thought revenge meant making Kelsey lose. But she still received what her father intended for her. So did Evan. I didn't take their money, their memories, or their place in Robert's life. I simply stopped allowing anybody to take mine. My home, my savings, my years with Robert, and my right to decide what happened to the rest of my life. I used to think keeping a family together meant swallowing whatever hurt the most. I don't anymore. Sometimes a boundary isn't what breaks a family. Sometimes it's the first honest thing that gives one a chance to heal. If you've ever had family mistake your kindness for permission, I'd like to hear what finally made you draw the line. Sometimes saying enough is where respect finally begins.